I want to continue talking about some of the things that happened to us while we were at Dawson, and I hope you'll find them interesting. First one I want to start with is our third daughter, Julie. Julie graduated as a teacher, so she started teaching at Princeton and then transferred to Dawson. Princeton was a parochial school there at the Catholic Church that didn't have any pension plan, so she taught there a couple of years, and then a job opened up at the Dawson school that had full benefits, or she quit and came to Dawson. And in all that process, she met a guy by the name of Steve Scott there, a local guy. And of course, one thing led to another, and they ended up getting married there at Dawson. And they still live there. They bought a house, fixer-upper, and I got involved with that. We put wooden cedar shingles on the side of the house. The roof had a sag in it, so I repaired that. A little later, we built an addition to the back of the house. And Billy and Jerry and others came down on weekends. And there was a group effort, that's for sure. But it was fun to do it with them, and free gratis, of course. Although Steve bought the material, but the labor was pretty expensive. It was an old house that needed a lot of work. All the wiring and plumbing and everything had to be changed. I remember one situation there where we were ripping the old wiring out. We took the meter off, everything, and there was still some lights in the garage, which was attached to the house. And so Steve was up in the rafters pulling that wiring out of there, and there was a wire coming in, and I threw him up a pair of side cutters to cut it off and make it easier to get it out of there, since it was all old stuff and it's all going to be thrown in the garbage. So when he cut through that wire, the fire flew and it ruined the side cutter. It just burned the steel right off. I'll never forget the look on his face when he got into that. And we discovered that the prior owner, or one of the people in the past, had gone up the light pole and attached it directly to the output of the transformer and bypassed the meter. And there wasn't any way for us to cut the power off. Well, we didn't even know it until Steve just did that in a little investigative process. So all those years, that thing it wasn't fused or anything. Our pastor was located in Princeton, and the church there at Dawson was one of the churches that he took care of in that remote area. Frequently he stopped, and when I say frequently, I mean once or twice a week. And I think he was lonely, but he also had a background in shipbuilding. His brothers and father, I guess, built ships at Paducah, and so he had a mechanical aptitude and interest too. So he'd come over, and once in a while I'd be working in the shop, and I left him weld some stuff one time, and just odd stuff. He didn't do much, but he enjoyed doing it, and we had a lot of fun with him. The kids all enjoyed him, and he was good company. And I suspect, though, part of the reason he came so often was Shirley's cooking, which was always top notch. This is a picture of Tom and John as altar boys with Father Roof. Another friend that Shirley and I had was a man by the name of Bud Neat. I met him here in Louisville before I moved to Frankfort through GE work. And I'll never forget the first time I saw him. He came into my office there at the plant here in Louisville, and he sat down in the chair there, and he put his feet up, and his shoes weren't even laced. Yeah, I thought to myself, what kind of a guy is this that we're doing business with? But as it turned out, he was probably the best toolmaker I've ever met, and certainly one of the brightest guys. So our acquaintance grew during the remaining time I was at Louisville plant, and then when I transferred to Frankfort, I used him for the same kind of work up there. And then when I transferred to Dawson, I got back in touch with him, and we did business all the time I was there. He started in business after he was discharged from the Army in World War II. He came home without anything much to offer. He wasn't a college guy or anything, he'd never gone to college. And so after the war he was looking for something to do. And I don't know how he found this little job. Apparently it was several thousand pieces of steel that needed drilled, certain size holes or whatever. And he didn't have any equipment. So he bought a little portable drill that he set on his kitchen table, and he processed those parts very satisfactorily, apparently, because he got more work and invested in tooling and so forth in his garage. And then over a period of years, he kept expanding and located different places, and he ended up buying the old Avery Tractor Works there in Louisville. There were 5 large manufacturing buildings on there, and he moved into one of those and eventually grew his operation to 60 toolmakers. The other parts of the property, he sold some of it off and leased the other buildings. And I know one lease was to a laundry there for 20 years at $20,000 a month. He told me one time he made more money buying that property than he did ever made on his tool making business. But nevertheless, after we moved back to Louisville in 1991 and I retired, he made it a practice to come over to our house about once a week and have a little toddy, as he called it. His favorite was Jack Daniels, and he and Shirley enjoyed a highball, but I didn't care much for it, so I joined them with a glass of wine, and we'd go out and have dinner somewhere. So we were very compatible and had a good time each time. He and my little Yorkie buddy Jeb became unusually friendly. I think Jebby liked him more than he did me. But whenever Bud would pull into the subdivision, we could be sure that it wouldn't be long before he pulled in the driveway, because Jeb would start to run around and bark and stand at the door and look out. And it was really pretty funny. Jeb could sense his approaching car. One time Bud turned the car off and coasted down the street and into our driveway, and tried to sneak out of the car without making any noise, carefully opening the door and so forth. But he didn't fool Jeb, and Jeb was going bananas inside the house until Bud arrived at the door. Bud was skilled in a lot of things, and metalworking was his prime vocation. And during the early 1970s, he heard about the Great Lakes Training Airplane Factory in St. Louis closed, and he bought the entire inventory and blueprints and so forth for it, and had all that shipped to Louisville to his plant. Unfortunately, on the way over, one of the trucks caught on fire, and he told me he was heartsick when he saw the molten aluminum pouring out of the burning trucks. He lost quite a bit of inventory, but nevertheless he saved several truckloads of it in the drawings. But he had parts enough to build an engine, and he had landing gear equipment saved, so he was able to make most of the balance of the parts and improve for flying experimental. Well, many times he came down to Dawson and landed at the dirt strip near the plant. The doctor there in Dawson, Dr. Cheney, also had a plane, and he had it hangared there at the Dawson Airport too, so he and Bud met several times and had interesting conversations about their exploits. These pictures were taken by me sitting in the front seat. The passenger sat in the front seat of the plane, and the pilot sat in the rear one. So I sat under the top wing while I took these pictures as we flew over Dawson. Fortunately, Bud had a stroke 20 years ago and died, so lost a good friend. One day I was at the nursing home there in Dawson, visiting the son of a family that lived there who had been severely injured in a car accident. Upon his graduation from high school, he went to a party with a carload of other friends and apparently they had something to drink, and on the way home he lost control of his car and hit a tree and suffered terrible brain injuries and was in a vegetative state. And I had met his father, and his father was devastated and spent practically every day there at his bedside praying for his recovery. But he never did recover. In that nursing home, too, was another patient. I didn't know him, but I stopped at his bedside, too, and he rolled his eyes toward me, but he couldn't speak, and he was paralyzed. I found what the story was behind his incapacitation. Apparently he was having intercourse with somebody's wife while the husband was at work, and for some reason the husband came home unexpectedly and caught the two of them in bed, and the husband picked up a baseball bat and hit this guy over the head several times with it and destroyed his brain. And as a result, he was in terrible shape. His face was disfigured from the crushed bones in his head, but all he could do was make some sound. The terrible ending for anybody, even though he was totally wrong for doing that. The old maid was in a nursing home down around the corner, and I don't know how old she was, but I visited her one time, and she owned a small house a few blocks away. She asked me to keep an eye on her stuff, so I did that for her. What could I do? Just walk by. One day I went down to see her, and she said she'd sold the house, and she asked me to check on it to make sure that the house was okay, and that until the sale could be completed. So I walked over to her house, not far, and there were a lot of people in the house, 5 or 6 people, and they were pulling up the linoleum, and they were all black, and I didn't know exactly what to do to proceed there, but I did go. I went up to the house and I knocked on the door, and I asked them what they were doing, and well, they got kind of flustered, but they had stripped off all the linoleum from the floor. They were stealing the linoleum, and anything that was loose in the house, they were stripping it out. So I just backed away. I told them that the old woman didn't want that, but I didn't interfere. One day I was sitting in my office there at the plant, and this salesman came in. The product he was selling I had heard about, but I didn't think we could use it, but I decided to talk to him. And it was probably 11 o'clock in the morning when he came there. He was a middle-aged guy and really congenial, very, very low-key, nice fellow. And he showed me his literature and so forth, and I saw that it wouldn't be applicable to anything that we were doing there at that plant. So I told him that, and I don't know how the conversation went on from there, but it became lunchtime, and so I invited him to lunch at the Squeeze Inn there in Dawson. This was a little restaurant, had a screen door with a cowbell on the return spring, and it was about 10 or 12 feet wide at the most, and some depth. I couldn't see all the way back, but the kitchen was in the back, and it was separated from the eating portion of it. And there was an older woman there that was the cook, and boy, she sure knew how to cook chicken. I asked her for a recipe, and she told me how she did it, but I never could duplicate what she did. It was absolutely delicious, and well, it was good, home cooking kind of stuff. So we had an interesting conversation, and I don't know how it turned to religion, but I told him about the miraculous healing I had seen in 1974 of this young lady who was sitting in a chair not 5 feet away from me. A man by the name of Derek Prince was kneeling in front of her and holding her feet in his hands. And from where I was standing, I could see that her right leg was withered and short, and the shoe on that foot had a big, thick sole on it to compensate for her deformity. And she had a cane, too, there with. As I watched, he prayed, I saw that leg grow in size and length to match her left leg. And it happened just as fast as I've told you about it. And she took those shoes off and stood up and danced around to the 2,000 onlookers. It was the revelation to me that the Lord was real, and that there's a reality just beyond our touch that we'll pass through to live there when we die. I told him of the effect it had on me, and that I was made clearly aware of the world that we can't see, and that the Lord was real, and He's the one that did it right there in front of my eyes. Well, he didn't say anything really much, and we parted. Then after lunch he went on his way, and I never saw him again. Never heard from him or anything until probably 15 years or more later, when I was in my office and the phone rang, and when I answered it he said who he was, and he said, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I had no recollection of him at all. I remembered the incident, but I didn't remember his name. And he told me that I had saved his life. Well, I find that hard to believe, but he told me that that day, that evening, he had planned to kill himself. He was a Jehovah's Witness. His family, his parents, grandparents, his wife, and all her relatives, and his children, he had 3 children, smaller ones, all diehard Jehovah's Witnesses. And during the past year or two, he had come to realize that Jehovah's Witnesses was a cult, and that he needed to get out of it. He had gone to a lot of churches to see what kind of services they had, and he had gone to a mass someplace, and he was really struck by that. He knew that he had to become a Catholic, and he told his wife that, and she said, "Well, if you do, I'm going to leave you and you'll never see your children again." He had persisted in trying to persuade her, but she wouldn't hear of it. She was absolutely adamant about leaving him if he did anything like that. And he'd become so depressed that he was going to lose his children and so forth, because he knew he couldn't fight the Jehovah's Witnesses without her. And he had decided to end it all. Then on the phone he said he wanted to thank me for telling him about the miraculous thing that I had seen so many years before that. And he continued by telling me that he had actually left his wife and children and joined the church, and was now at peace with his decision, because he felt very confident that he had made the right one in spite of the terrible pain that it caused him. But his salvation and eternal life was more important to him than anything here on this earth, and that he knew that the Jehovah's Witnesses were a cult. Their chances of salvation was pretty slim. So you never know. The word's the most powerful weapon that anybody ever has, and used improperly can cause, well, it can create wars. Very simple. For example, Hitler told his army to invade Poland on September 1st, 1939, and look at what happened in the next 6 years. One time, a business associate and I, we're both GE employees, we're in Chicago, and we were there a day or two. Now, I don't know what we were doing there, but it's incidental. One morning at breakfast, I bought Chicago Times, I guess it was, and on the front page was an article about, that said, "Dawson Springs man injures himself," or some such. So of course, there I was in Chicago reading about Dawson Springs, and the article went on to describe this situation that caused this article to be written. There was a young man in Dawson, I didn't know who he was, or had never heard of him before this, about 18 or so, had been smoking some kind of a drug, and mixing it with alcohol, and lost his mind. But apparently he had been raised in an evangelical home, because he knew the scriptures, and in his drunken, mindless situation, he decided that he was committing sin. The scriptures, it says that if your eye causes you to sin, cut it out and cast it into the sea, and or if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off, and your foot leads you into sin, you cut it off, and it's better to live without those members than to go to hell. And of course, it's not a literal command, it's a metaphorical description of what you should do. When anything is causing you to commit sin, you need to deal with it. Well, this guy took it literally, and he literally gouged out his left eye and cut off his left hand at the wrist and cut off his foot at the ankle. Literally did that. Of course, that was so spectacularly terrible that it made the Chicago papers. I saw him not many months after that, and of course he was still crippled with a crutch and so forth. I suppose maybe 10 years, 20 years later, I saw him in Dawson, and he was still there. I don't know what kind of work he was able to do, but he had a prosthetic foot and a hook on his hand. Of course, he had an empty eye socket. It's terrible to contemplate the kind of insanity that it took to do that. In a previous video of our life at Cedar Hollow Drive, I mentioned that I bought a new 1970 Mustang, and of course we still had it at Dawson Springs, and I maintained possession of it until 1998 when I finally sold it. While we were at Dawson, we had 3 going to college, and Jerry was going to UK, and the transportation issues were kind of difficult for all of us, and so I loaned Jerry my Mustang to move back and forth from UK. And while he was there, he had an accident with a motorcycle, which did some damage on the right side, or the front, so that more. And then shortly after, he encountered a woman that came through a red light and T-boned the right side of it at the A-pillar. So the insurance company determined that it wasn't worth repairing and paid me for the book value of it. And I bought it back from him for $200, so I maintained possession of it. So I bought a new door for it and a new fender on the right side, and I connected the A-pillar to a telephone pole via a ratcheting little hand winch that I'd bought at Harbor Freight, and I just pulled that A-pillar out to its original position. Actually, it was in a closer position where it should have been than it came from the factory, because when I put the door back on and made the alignments, I didn't need all the shims under the door hinge that the factory had used to make the alignment. But anyway, I fixed that side, and it was fine. It was new parts, and I painted it. And not long after that, I loaned it to Annette, and she backed into something, or I don't know what she did, but she hit the left rear quarter panel and damaged it pretty severely. So these pictures show replacing that rear quarter panel of that Mustang, and it was a big job. But it came out all right. I managed to straighten the adjacent parts and fit it up okay. But kids, that Mustang wasn't a primo car. It had always had some kind of problem with it too. But on our move to Cincinnati, I was driving my company car, and Shirley was following in the Mustang, and we kept close together, and we were on the Interstate 75 north of Louisville, just a few miles, and she was following closely behind, and all of a sudden I saw her pull off to the side of the road, so I of course stopped, and I went back to her, and she said the engine stopped, and so I got in and I started it, but I noticed immediately there wasn't any oil pressure, and so of course that couldn't be run without oil pressure. So it was a big commotion there along the interstate, getting a truck to tow it down to Billy and Annette's house in Frankfort, where it would be safe from any further damage, and until I could look at it. So the first opportunity I had, I went back down there and started working on the engine, and I found that the teeth on the timing chain had broken off. It was a plastic gear, and teeth had broken off and gotten into the oil pump and broke the shaft off of the oil pump, and so it lost pressure as well as being out of time. So that meant pulling the engine, and these photos show the engine on a table all torn down right to the last bolt because it had damaged some bearings and a piston that had gotten scored from the lack of oil pressure. And that was a major job. It took a number of trips to Frankfurt to accomplish that over weekends. And the reason I sold it is that every time I went out to start it, there was something else wrong with it. Either a water leak or brake leak or something. So I just got weary of it. Billy had a little Chevy something or other, Pinto, I guess it was, maybe. I don't know. It was one of those little cars that was made in that period of time, and they were pure junk. And he had a problem with the engine on that car. It kept blowing head gaskets, and they came down with it, but on their way back it blew another head gasket, and so we pulled it back to Dawson from the parkway, and I looked at it, and that block was damaged. I sold it for Billy to some local guy who wanted the transmission out of it. There was another, I don't remember whose car it was now, but the transmission went bad in it. It was an automatic. The price to fix an automatic in an old car far exceeds its value. So we pulled it out of the car and took it into my workshop there, and I tore the thing down, and it didn't have a great deal of damage to it. And I bought the parts and put it back together and got them back on the road. But there was always some automotive repair work needed to be done. I had an accident with that 78 Mercury Marquis that I owned at that time. Hit the rear quarter panel. A guy slid into me and didn't do a lot of damage, but it ruined the vinyl coating on the fender. And he didn't have any insurance, so I was out of luck. And so I repaired the metal and bought a new decal for it. It was a large decal. I remember it cost $35. So as I was applying it though, and this is the first time I'd ever handled anything like that, I got a big wrinkle in it that I couldn't get out, and it looked terrible. So I thought I'd pull it back off and stretch it, and when I did, I tore it. So I bought another one. This time I was successful in getting it on. There was always something needing repaired, and I never took any cars to the garage in those days. I always dress up to go to work with a tie and a jacket and decent shoes and so forth. And I used to walk very frequently to the plant in my office, which was about a mile away. And so I remember this one morning, it was cold, and I decided to walk, and I had a top coat and dressed up, and I was walking through the back streets in order to get to the plant. And I was walking along, and I noticed that this fellow had started building a garage, and so I was observing his progress each day, more or less. And this one morning, I stepped into a hole, and I fell, and I really sprained my ankle, pretty severe. My right ankle was weak from numerous sprains over my lifetime, and so it was weaker than probably would have been otherwise, but nevertheless, this was a pretty severe sprain, and it was too painful for me to stand up on it. So there weren't any sidewalks there, and I was in the street when I was walking this morning, and I was lying on the street there in my dress clothes, and there was very, very minimal traffic on this street. And so I laid there a while, and I was hoping my ankle would get strong enough so at least I could hobble back to the house, which was 2 or 3 blocks away. And I was prone there in the street, and I heard this car coming, and so I looked up to see whether they saw me. It was daylight, of course, but I looked up, and it was the car. I didn't recognize the driver, of course, and he just swerved out of the way and kept on going. He never even relatively reduced his speed to see if I was a corpse or what. But anyway, he went on his merry way, and so I laid there another 5 or 10 minutes. I really don't know, quite some time between vehicles passing there. Then another one came from the opposite direction, and he did the same thing. He drove on the berm of the road to miss me, but I guess I need to be thankful he did that much anyway. But he never stopped either. 3 cars went by and doing the same thing, and I guess if I'd been dressed in rags or some obnoxious outfit, I could maybe understood that. But to see a prone human lying on the street, I personally would have been a little curious to see if there was a need there or not. But anyway, eventually this pickup truck came up alongside of me and stopped, and he rolled down his window and asked me what was the matter. I told him I'd sprained my ankle, and I asked him if he would help me get in the truck and take me home. And he says, all right. So he pulled into this driveway. He had a little difficulty getting in because I was along the edge of his driveway, and that's where he lived. And that's why he stopped. He was going home. But anyway, he did get me in the truck and took me home. But I have a sneaking hunch if that hadn't been his driveway, I might still be lying there. I still don't understand today why someone didn't offer to help. Anyway, that's life in Dawson Springs, I guess. Okay, I think we'll stop this one here and go to the next one.